Welcome to Free Kiwis. It's just your hosts today, myself here in New Zealand, and our foreign correspondent, James Kierstead, who is in South America in Bogota, Colombia, correct?
Almost. I'm in Colombia, but I've actually moved on from Bogota to a lovely little colonial town called Villa de Leyva, which I highly
Oh,
recommend to anybody traveling in Colombia.
very nice. And we will, in fact, have a Colombian connection with the episode today because we're going to talk a bit about an election that's imminent in Colombia. But first, a thing closer to home, academic freedom in New Zealand, and in particular institutional neutrality, which is the idea that universities should not take public positions on political matters in order to avoid biasing academic debate within universities on those things. And we're here specifically to talk about a letter that Vice Chancellor of Otago University, Grant Robertson, sent to all of his staff and students, in which we think that he has probably violated that provision of the legislation. So, James, what's your take on this? Maybe describe the letter and go
Well,
from there.
well, yeah, I mean, he's definitely violated the spirit, if not the letter. I think both the spirit and the letter of the new legislation, because the new legislation basically says that universities can't take institutional positions on matters that don't directly concern their role or functions.
Yeah.
And this is actually about the mooted legislation, the legislation which I understand is currently being discussed in New Zealand Parliament about the definition of men and women. I think it's called something like the definition of man and woman bill or something like that.
Yeah.
Or woman and man, I should say. So Grant Robertson sends an email to all staff and all students, the whole community, as I understand it, and he says, "This brings me to something I want to talk about today. You may be this is the relevant bit of the email. It's not the whole email, but it's one section. You may be aware, this is Grant Robertson again, of the definition of woman and man amendment bill. Oh yeah, that's the name, which passed first reading in Parliament last week. I know this bill will be upsetting for many in our Otago community, particularly those who identify as and love and support our trans, intersex, Takatapui, gender diverse, and non-binary whānau. At a personal level, I find this legislation to be unnecessary and disturbing. As a university, we remain resolute in upholding our commitments to respect and inclusion. Again, student health or Te Pau Whirinaki is available for anybody needing extra support. Now, just on
Right.
a side note, I just want to say there that if I was a student or staff member, especially an international student or staff member of Otago University, and I read that email about Te Pau Whirinaki, I would think, what the hell is that? Right? Because there's always this habit of using Maori names that a lot of the time like excludes people in the community who don't
Not
know.
not particularly inclusive of international
No.
students.
Anyway, that's just a minor point.
Yeah. So I guess the issue, like what he would probably claim, is that he gave a personal view about the legislation. So he's not in that at that moment speaking as the vice chancellor.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think, yeah.
And then he goes on to say something on behalf of the university, which is that the university would provide support and be supportive to everybody. So he would say he hasn't violated the legislation because he did give a personal view, but he's allowed to do that because he can. And then he hasn't given an institutional position. But I
Well,
guess we'd probably argue that that's rather disingenuous.
yeah, right. So it comes from his office as the vice chancellor, has a logo at the bottom of it, sent to everybody. And so everybody who works at the university is going to be very clear that, this is the position of the chief boss of the university, and probably the rest of the university hierarchy is going to fall behind this particular position. And as we know, New Zealand universities don't exactly have a sterling record when it comes to kind of not, getting rid of people because of their views or, making everybody feel welcome, including people of different political orientations. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly the kind of thing that the institutional neutrality provision was introduced to try to reduce. And for me, this sort of just speaks to the kind of arrogance and the sense of impunity that there is at universities, and especially the sort of ease with which Grant Robertson, who used to be, was very recently a Labour Party politician, kind of was just in charge of this university, but he sort of thinks of it as a left-wing space, right? He just sort of thinks this is our institution. We're just going to kind of take a left-wing position. And so, what he does in this email, for me, emotionally, it feels very much like when Victoria University of Wellington finished the Living Pa, and there was a statement put out about that saying, isn't it great that we're celebrating Mataranga Maori, right? I think the vice chancellor, the pro vice chancellor Maori said that. So you've been following the debate about academic freedom in New Zealand. You'll know, which hopefully Free Kiwis listeners will have, you'll know that that's an extremely controversial thing to be talking about, Mataranga Maori. So that statement for me was a kind of, middle finger lifted to people who cared about free speech. And I think that Grant Robertson's email is along the same lines, right? Because he just sort of lists all of these different identities: trans,
Yeah.
intersex, taxonomy, gender diverse, non-binary. And some people don't actually think those exist, right? And then,
And he didn't mention supporting gender critical feminists, for example, who would probably like this kind of legislation. I mean, we may have some criticisms about how it's drafted. I think there's a circular definition in it and it could be better worded, but uh, gender critical feminists amongst the university staff in general would be supportive of defining man and woman biologically.
yeah, exactly. And there are lots of other people in the community who probably take that view as well. I mean, a lot of scientists, I think, deep down know that there are two sexes.
Even
Um,
if some of them are too cowardly to say so.
that's right. So, and actually, I mean, Grant Robinson should know that a lot of feminists in the university are upset about this because we had various surveys that, and we sort of reproduced those and analyzed them in our report on academic freedom, showing that the the second the thing that university academics and students in New Zealand are the second most worried about talking about after colonialism and Te Tiriti o Waitangi is gender and sex. So this is
Yep.
an extremely controversial subject within the university. And this is why, so I go back to the kind of emotional tone of this. He really is kind of doubling down and saying kind of screw everybody who doesn't agree with this view. You're harming our students. And so,
Yep.
that's obviously the sort of paradigm of not being neutral, not being kind of a mature chair. He's meant to be a kind of chairperson. The university is a space for debate and for research and for different views. But now he wants to sort of play politics and keep playing politics.
Yeah. I mean, it would be a bit too cute, wouldn't it, to say I'm only speaking in my personal capacity, even though I'm sending this email from my office as the Vice Chancellor to all staff and students, which only senior leadership can do, and aligning my personal view with a statement about what the university will do, which is in itself slanted because it's offering support to one side of the debate but not the other.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, so the question for me is, well, I mean, okay, one lesson I think from this is that the legislation that they passed last year, which I think in general was a good thing, it was far too weak, and it was far too weak
Yeah.
in a way that sort of many of us pointed to. In particular, there are really no teeth in the bill, right? The universities have to draw up these free speech policies, and as part of that, they have to have an institutional neutrality policy, or they have to maintain institutional neutrality. Or they have to have something in their statement about institutional neutrality. But then if they do things like this, they just casually violate institutional neutrality. What happens? Uh,
Well, somebody could make a complaint to a person who sits below Grant Robertson in the hierarchy in the university.
right. So if you're a gender critical feminist, you could make a complaint to your dean, I suppose, or your head of school. And
Yeah.
then the head of school, you know, would have to kind of go against Grant Robertson and everybody else in the hierarchy, which we know never happens in New Zealand universities, right? Because everyone kind of just does what the boss says.
Or in any hierarchical organization, that's unlikely to happen.
Yeah, it is unlikely, but I think
So what we
particularly
need is some kind of office outside the university, an independent office that can not only process complaints about violations of this policy or this legislation, but also have some kind of remedy that imposes an incentive on the universities to stick to it, like they lose some money or something like that.
right. So for me, this is just another sign that the main party in the coalition at the moment has just been incredibly naive about the universities and just sort of thinks, oh, the universities aren't so bad, they'll police themselves. They're not going to police themselves, they're not going to reform themselves. You actually have to do something about it.
Yeah. So I think you had suggested that we adopt a similar approach to the UK on this, which is to have, I think you called it a free speech czar or a commissioner who can look into universities on free expression and academic freedom grounds. And in the UK, does that person have the power to impose penalties?
Well, this is
if they
actually kind of
repeatedly
come.
breach this kind of thing? Or
This is kind of difficult at the moment because the UK legislation, I mean, you have to say this in support of the Conservative Party in the UK, which I don't support in sort of every way at the moment, but they did actually try and give that legislation teeth. Unfortunately, then, just as it was passed,
the
the
government changed?
Labour Party came into power and wanted to kind of get rid of it. But a lot of academics kind of rose up against that, and they didn't get rid of it entirely. And that legislation does actually have a provision for an external appeal. Originally, it was going to be even stronger. It was going to be basically an appeal to a court by this so-called statutory tort. A tort is when you're wronged in some way, and it would have been actually by statute rather than by precedent. But they do have something a little weaker than that, but it's still reasonably strong. I think it was an appeal to the Office for Students. Now, the reason that this is kind of difficult at the moment, difficult in terms of what's going to happen and knowing what's going to happen, is that there was just this really important court case. The ruling has just come through, the University of Sussex versus the Office for Students. And this court case actually preceded the current legislation, but it is relevant to it because the Office for Students levied a massive fine on the University of Sussex. I think it was
Oh,
£500,000 because
that
they
was
put
over Kathleen Stock's treatment, was it?
it kind of was that I don't think it was directly about Kathleen Stock, but it was related because they had in their internal regulations that you basically, when you were teaching, I think you had to present trans people in a positive light, which obviously is not particularly neutral because, and it's kind of prejudiced, right? Because trans people are probably like anybody else, right? They have positive, some of them are nice, some of them are less nice, so you try and treat them fairly, not just say positive things about them. That's kind of patronizing. But anyway, because they had this provision, the Office for Students levied this massive fine. And then the University of Sussex was like, wait, you can't do that. We're going to appeal. And unfortunately, I think for the free speech movement, the University of Sussex actually lost that. So now it looks, and the Office for Students didn't appeal, I don't think, which is interesting. I don't know why. Why
You
they
mean the
didn't.
university won that,
Sorry,
the
the
appeal?
University of Sussex won and the Office of Students lost. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, did I say the reverse? So the Office of Students lost, and that basically calls a lot of the kind of teeth in this legislation into doubt because they've been weakened by this. Basically the courts have said you can't do this, and they're the kind of main power. They're the main body in which the sort of regulatory powers are vested.
So what were the grounds for that decision in the courts? Why did the university win when it had obviously violated Kathleen Stock's academic freedom and presumably other things that were associated with that? What did the ruling say that I mean, where is the bar for the office to be able to fine a
Okay,
university?
I can't remember exactly. I think that it had something to do with whether what they put in their regulations was part of their founding documents and constitution, because I think there's some other thing that says universities have to be neutral, institutionally neutral in terms of their founding documents and stuff like that. And and the Office of Students had fined the University of Sussex because they put this in some kind of regulation that I think the court decided didn't amount to a kind of constitutional document. So that was the reason that Sussex won. But if people want to know more about this, there are some Free Kiwis interviews that I did in London with Abhishek Sahau as the case was ongoing, and with Freddie Attenborough just recently. And Freddie Attenborough in particular has written a lot of really good articles. He posts them on LinkedIn regularly, and they go into a lot of depth and detail about that case in particular and other cases relevant to academic freedom.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the New Zealand legislation is weak in other ways, in my opinion, as well. One is that the statement about institutional neutrality uses the word should rather than must. It says that universities should not engage in taking positions on matters of public debate or whatever it is. So universities can interpret that as saying, well, ideally, the legislation says we should do that, but it doesn't say we have to. And also, it says that universities have to have statements on uh, freedom of expression and institutional neutrality. And I've heard at least one source from a university say that it's a statement, not a policy, so we don't actually have to stick to it.
Exactly. I mean, that was again something that people pointed out at the time. It was a very strange way of going about it, basically saying you have to drop your own statement. And to be fair to them, to be fair to the government, they did say your statement has to have certain features because before that, some universities had put out their own free speech statements to say, oh, look, we're complying, and they were
Yeah.
kind of, not worth the paper they were written on. So now they have to have statements which at least kind of sound like they're supporting free speech. But as you say, I mean, they don't actually have to do any, no one's holding them to
They
account
don't have
in the
to stick
statement. Right?
stick stick to them. Well,
No.
they might say we don't. It's a statement, and so it's an aspirational thing. We don't actually have to do it.
Yeah, so we'll see what happens in this case with Grant Robertson, but I assume, I fully expect that nothing will happen at all.
Oh, I'm
And
sure
if
you're
nothing
right.
happens at all, then that just strengthens the hand of people like Grant Robertson, who seem to just assume that, yeah, the university is a space for kind of left-wing politics. And we know a lot of our former colleagues at Vic saw universities in those ways. And meanwhile, New Zealand taxpayers are paying, millions
They're
of
funding it.
taxes to these universities because I think some people still assume, oh, there are these places where, my kids can go and people will be, and their professors will be kind of moderate and broad-minded and level-headed, and it's not a kind of political
Yeah.
operation. Of course, there are lots of academics who are doing good work in not a particularly political way, but the tail very much wags the dog, as you know, in terms of like the political radicals really can do whatever they want, and there's basically nobody that opposes them.
Yeah. And there is another element to Grant Robertson's letter as well, which I think is worth touching on, which is that he also criticizes the abolition of the fees-free year for tertiary study in Budget 2026. Now, on the face of it, that's okay because the legislation has a carve out for matters that affect universities' operations, which clearly funding decisions do. So the University of Otago is actually allowed to publicly oppose the budget decision to cut that fees-free year. However, I would argue that he went too far because he didn't just oppose the policy, he praised students for protesting against it and kind of encouraged people to be uh, politically activated about it, which is a more political statement. I don't know what your view on that is, but I don't think he should have done that as Vice Chancellor because, especially actually, since he's a former senior Labour minister,
Yeah.
he's very much nailing political colours to the mast. He's not just saying, we don't agree with cutting this fees free year because it's bad for our students or because we think we'll get less students or whatever.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think that if the universities were really kind of contested spaces and balanced spaces, neutral spaces, then he would probably have known that he has to go into that new job by kind of, not getting rid of all his political philosophy and the things he's done and the things he thinks, but basically make clear to people that he's not a Labour politician anymore. And instead, again, I think this is evidence for this impunity and arrogance that I talk about in the university sector, where people just kind of assume, oh, these are our institutions. We can say what we want, and they sort of they see them as kind of places. They may not say themselves that they see them as spaces for left-wing activism. That's not the terms in which they would put it. But as we both know, they say that the university needs to be used to promote social justice, which is actually a kind of left-wing view of things, right,
Left
usually?
wing activism. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I well remember an episode when I was at Vic when a head of school announced to everybody at a staff meeting that how proud she was to be in a faculty that was committed to social justice. Of course,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
sounds good, but we know what social justice really means.
That happens all the
And
time.
I had to say, actually, your sense of social justice, I don't agree
Yeah.
with. And I'm one of these very stupid people who would just say what they think because I do on principle. But most people who are in my position are just going to feel cowed by that.
No, and that's taken for granted at universities that that people are going to say that the department's in favor of social justice. And I think, we've lost the sense of shock around that. I mean, I think you really have to consider, imagine what would happen if you went into a university program and the head of the program or the head of school or whatever stood up and said, our program is all about conservatism. Our program is all about promoting Christianity,
Right.
or
It's
it's
all
all
about
about piety,
traditionalism.
to make it a bit
It's
more
about
abstract, like social justice. It's all
it's
about
about it's
piety.
a yep. It's about pride and Western civilization, whatever you like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. You would lose your job very quickly. There'd be a huge uproar, right? Alt-right person in university or something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, So, but yeah, going back to your point about the protests, I also remember Vic. I can never remember the name of this one, but you remember there were these protests about land development.
There
Um,
were two actually. There was
yeah,
Ihumatao, the land
Hiromata, that's the one.
protest,
Yeah,
and there was also the students' strike for climate change. And on
yeah,
both of those occasions, the university gave students dispensation to go and attend the protests and said they wouldn't incur any penalties for not handing in their work that day, and they didn't have to go to classes that day, and so on.
yeah,
And I was associate dean at the time, and I remember in academic committee we discussed this, and actually there was pretty good pushback from some of the associate deans, especially this crusty old Scotsman who was from law, who basically said, "Well, that's not a protest; that's a student outing." If that's what you're doing, because a protest entails taking some kind of a risk, and all you're
yeah.
doing is saying you just go and promulgate the views that the university agrees with, and there'll be no academic penalty if you don't show up on that day.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I think imagine what would happen if there was an email from the vice chancellor saying, the ACT Party conference is next week, so why don't you all go along to that and there'll be no consequences. I mean, maybe that's too partisan, but imagine, okay, how about this? Like,
Posey Parker.
well, exactly, that's actually a good example. Or like Brian Tamaki is doing a rally. We're proud of all our students who take part in Brian Tamaki's rally, right? It would never
Yeah,
happen.
yeah,
But it
yeah.
seems funny because things are so skewed that like the far left kind of activism, that's just taken for granted that they're going to support that. But if you think about, well, even if you think about kind of like moderate right-wing things, I don't know, maybe like, oh, there's a business forum or something, a young people's business forum. We're going to give you time off to do that, or allow you not to hand your essays in on time. Even that, I think, would prompt outrage.
Yeah, yeah. So they're so steeped in their bias that they can't even see it, and I think that's true. Uh, it kind of touches on a wider point about the radical left, which is that I think they truly believe, or at least many of them do, that they're on the side of virtue, and so really all right-thinking people would think this, and if you don't think that, you're obviously not a right-thinking person. Or you might be a right-wing
Yeah.
thinking person, but
Yeah.
you're not a correct thinking person, and so really
Yeah.
that's outside the tent, as it were. That's beyond the Overton window. That's obviously not included in institutional neutrality because that would be like being neutral about Nazism. We couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And,
That's exactly right.
so
And you'll notice as well how like the views that they now take to be like everybody has to hold these views, otherwise you get cast out. They're actually incredibly extreme. Like the views on gender that is in that are in Grant Robinson's email, like the idea that they're non-binary people. Like that's the kind of thing that nobody thought about 5 or 10 years ago, right? Some people did in like university humanities departments. And now it's sort of mandatory. And it's still probably the case that I think probably most New Zealanders don't think that there are such things as non-binary people, right? In reality, there are people who identify as non-binary. And of course, we shouldn't necessarily kind of bully them or we should treat people with dignity. But, there are different views on this topic, whether these things actually exist. And now it seems like one of the most extreme views is mandatory, not only in kind of bourgeois dinner parties, but it's the kind of party line in our universities, and we're funding our universities to be spaces for discussion and research, and not to sort of push these extreme views.
that's right. Well, we've got because we're on a free version of Zoom today. We have only got 15 minutes left, and I would like to take advantage of the fact that you're our foreign correspondent on the ground in Colombia at the time when an election is looming. I confess to knowing very little about it, so perhaps we could pivot to that and just talk a bit about who the parties are and who's likely to win and who's in
Well,
government and what the policies are and what. Yeah, I think you've done a bit of interviewing of people around in the streets.
yeah, I'm not sure if I can do all of that, but I can tell you, I'll start actually with Peru, funnily enough, because Peru is also having a two-round presidential election at the moment. They have these two-round systems here, like in France, where first of all the candidates are in the pot, and then the people who come first and second are get to be in the second round, and then there's a runoff election. And in Peru, it's between Keiko Fujimori, or Fujimori as they pronounce it here, and Roberto Sanchez. And the reason this is interesting, and it's kind of a setup for the Colombian situation as well, is that Both of these people kind of have an interesting past. So South American politics is kind of a reminder of how nice it is in New Zealand. I guess this is one of the themes of what I'm going to be saying. So Keiko
Because no one shoots one another.
Fujimori, what's that?
There are no guns involved in New Zealand elections.
Well, exactly. So Keiko Fujimori is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, and Fujimori is obviously a Japanese name. Alberto Fujimori was actually born in Lima. His parents emigrated from Japan. But he became, first of all, a kind of legitimately elected center-right figure. And then he did this thing which they call I think, autogolpe, a sort of self-coup. And he got rid of the parliament. He purged the judiciary. And he basically became a dictator. There were death squads, forced sterilizations. However, it's very small, however. I mean, those are awful things, right? Um, People credit him with crushing this kind of narco-terrorist movement, the Sendero Luminoso. He reduced hyperinflation. So Keiko Fujimori still has a lot of support from basically affluent people in Peru. Roberto Sanchez, her opponent, is the protege of Pedro Castillo, who was a left-wing leader who was elected legitimately and then tried to do one of these self-coup things as recently as 2022. So the point is, it's interesting to me that in that election, there are these two figures that have a very interesting past, or at least, people that they're related to or people that they're associated with have very interesting past. And they're actually, I guess I was interested, I thought of you when I saw the headline because in the second round, the voting has actually taken place in Peru, and they're in a situation of empate técnico. I saw this phrase everywhere in the newspaper, which means a technical tie, technical draw, because
Oh, right.
the voting was so close. It's something like 50.1 versus, what's it, 49.9? Is that how it works? Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. But that, I mean, that's still a lot of votes in a
it's
country
something,
as large, populous as
it may,
Peru.
might even be closer than that. I think I saw on TV, it was something like a few thousand votes in it. So
Right.
in a situation of high polarization, of course, no one's going to be satisfied when the final votes are counted, and they're going to say that the other side kind of it was illegitimate, etc.
Oh, I
Anyway,
see.
so that was all just meant to be a setup for Colombia. So Colombia's got these two figures, Ivan Cepeda, who's kind of like the establishment left candidate. He's leader of the historic PAC party, which is recently formed but includes the former Colombian Communist Party. And he's the son of this guy called Manuel Cepeda Vargas, who was a big kind of communist, full-on communist figure. He was assassinated, it looks like, by army officers, right-wing army officers in Bogota in 1994, literally kind of gunned down in the streets. Even during his life, he had to go into exile. Um, there was kind of a strange quasi-authoritarian government in Colombia at the time where the centrist liberal party and the right-wing conservative party kind of alternated in power, and the communists were kind of pushed out.
And
Um,
when the most powerful person in the country was actually Pablo Escobar, the drug lord, probably.
yeah, exactly. And so that brings in this whole thing, FARC, the FARC organization, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, which were also a kind of terrorist movement, I suppose, armed extremist group. And so Ivan Cepeda, this current candidate, his father was associated with them, and the communists at the time had this phrase, which was something like "all means are on the table." So
Right.
they didn't necessarily contribute to the violence themselves in a personal capacity, but they kind of
Tacitly
tolerated.
encouraged it.
They were associated with FARC, and they kind of tolerated it
Yep.
very openly. Now, Ivan Cepeda has actually denounced FARC and political violence, unlike his father. So, and you could say this about some of these figures, like with Keiko Fujimori as well. You could say, well, they're sort of round two, or they're Mark two, and they're actually distancing themselves from the sins of their fathers, in these cases, literally. But to me, it's kind of very interesting and slightly unsavory that these people are so closely related to the past, the much more violent past. Okay, and so that's the leftist establishment figure. On the right, we have this guy called Abelardo de la Espriella, who is kind of a populist right winger, and I think internationally people compare him to Trump, most obviously, and maybe Nigel Farage and people like that. To me, he's actually much more right wing. I've seen posters around this town where he's saying La Patria, like everything for the fatherland and nothing outside the fatherland. which to me is actually, I
Sounds a
know
bit
this is,
Mussolini-esque.
yeah, exactly. Like this is the kind of thing that university academics say, but I think it's actually true in this case that it's sort of
Everything
reminiscent.
within the state, nothing against
Yeah,
the state.
reminiscent of fascist slogans. So De La Espriella is also someone with interesting connections. He was a protege of the former right-wing president Álvaro Uribe Vélez, and for also a good friend of his and a sort of defense lawyer for him. And Uribe was in power basically all through the noughties, and he's a big figure in Colombia because he, kind of like Fujimori in Peru, he crushed this paramilitary group FARC, and he's probably one of the reasons why I'm able to travel around Colombia without too much, violence, without seeing too much violence or being the victim of it, because he kind of really pushed FARC back. He basically militarily defeated them, and they had to come to the negotiating table. Um, but there's some fairly unsavory things about De La Spria as well in terms of his associations. He has links to this group called AUC, AUC, Autodefensas Unidades de Colombia, the sort of, I guess, self-defense units of Colombia. So that's a right-wing paramilitary organization, and he acted as a defense lawyer for some of their senior commanders as well. So yeah, so it's very polarized here in Colombia and also I think in Peru, and you have these very kind of deep pasts, these feuds. This polarization continues, and in other countries like New Zealand and Canada, we can talk about polarization as a recent thing. Whereas in these countries, what we're seeing now, in some cases, in a lot of ways, is a diminution of the really violent polarization that they had before. I mean, in Colombia, it was actually a full-on civil war for a while, even between the kind of more centrist liberals and the conservatives. And then when you bring the communists into the mix and the left-wing paramilitaries and the right-wing paramilitaries, is obviously even more violence. So hopefully that won't come back. And we'll just have the kind of polarization that you see sort of online in English-speaking countries. But you can definitely see that
Yeah.
different areas are very either pro Cepeda, like Bogota, and once you get into the countryside, you see a lot more signs about De La Espriella and how he's defending the fatherland and he's, standing for conservative values and so on and so forth.
Yeah. One thing, we haven't got much time left, but one thing I'd just like to explore briefly is the historical context of these conflicts that take place in South America, because there's no reason in principle why South America shouldn't be like Australia and New Zealand and Canada. They were colonized in this case by the Spanish rather than the English, and maybe that's got something to do with it. But they're places that are in resources.
Yeah, I don't really have
Yeah,
any ready explanation of that, but it is interesting that South America split up into Spanish-speaking South America, even if you leave Brazil to one side, split up into all these different countries. Whereas with Canada and the US, you get these unions of different states or provinces or different colonies basically that endure and they become these kind of continent-spanning units. But yeah, it's hard to explain. I mean, I think probably the fact that South America relies so heavily on certain commodities has played a role. I mean, definitely with drugs, the fact that they're illegal, and so you have this black
yeah,
market
yeah.
developing, you have these very powerful and very well-funded groups that can sometimes just be interested in selling drugs, but sometimes they're also interested in certain types of politics, whether that's of the far left or the far right. All of that, I think, makes things a lot
And
more
it's
difficult.
hard to know it's hard to know whether the drug industry is a symptom or a cause in a way as well, because why is it that cocaine is grown in Colombia but not Australia? I mean, there's some reason for that. You could grow cocaine in Australia. Yeah,
I think that there's something about coca leaves that they are better grown in the Andes, but I'm not so sure about that. But yeah, there's been a lot of violence in South America, and also there's been, this is something that you can even get from things like magical realism, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, this constant recurrence of dictators, absurd looking kind of dictators to us, with, their chest covered with medals and all the rest.
yeah.
And there's a really good series, a really long series on the life of Mario Vargas Llosa, who was not the president of Peru. He ran as a politician in Peru for a while, and he's a famous writer. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And near the end of that, his son, who's actually the interviewer in the series, asks him, you're more optimistic now about Peru than you were. Why is that? And one of the things that Mario Vargas Llosa says is that we've really turned our back on dictatorship. That's not going to be a thing anymore in Peru. And he was running as a center-right candidate around the time that Alberto Fujimori won the election, and then soon afterwards became a dictator, at which point Mario Vargas Llosa became a huge critic, and I think he left Peru. But I think it's quite sad. I mean, I don't think Keiko Fujimori is definitely going to make herself a dictator if she gets in, or that Roberto Sanchez is. But I do sort of think as an outsider coming here, it's very striking how the sort of political lineages in these countries, the political dynasties still exist, and neither has really made a kind of clean start. And there's no sort of complete clean break with the past. And I hope that happens at some point. Another way of looking at it is, as I say, that these figures who were kind of the children of the previous dictators or people with links to radical movements and violent movements, they have kind of moved on, and so that they were better than the previous generation. So hopefully that
You could
remains the
say
case.
this in some ways. You could say the same of Marine Le Pen. I mean, she's certainly not as extreme as her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was an out-and-out fascist.
Yeah.
Um,
But I mean,
yeah,
even Le Pen, like with those people, we're looking at like what their views are. I don't know if Le Pen was actually involved in any actual violence, but some of these people, I
no, that's
think,
true.
still,
Yeah,
anyway. But we'll have to wrap up. So hopefully, these elections take place and they're free and fair in Colombia, and yeah, and we get a winner who doesn't turn himself into a dictator.
and when is the election?
21st of
The
June.
polling, 21st of June. Well, maybe we can check in again after that and see how it all went.
Sounds good.